What's going on, guys? Before getting into this video, I just want to let everyone know that my goal for this podcast is to have scholars, experts, and academics on and let them present their views, let them give the evidence for the views that they believe in. And I say this because I know a lot of you may be coming from a Christian background. I myself, I'm a believing Christian, but I also believe in having a discussion, hearing other viewpoints, approaching history and the text from an objective academic standpoint, and just allowing the evidence to speak for itself. I don't think as Christians we should shy away from these things and ignore it or take a completely theological approach to the Bible. Now, there's a place for that, obviously, in the church and in our communities and whatnot. And there'll be times where I have people on of faith and it'll be a different kind of conversation. But my main goal is to just look at history, look at the evidence, take an objective historical approach, and go from there. Because honestly, I think if we have a faith where we can't look at the evidence, look at history from an academic point of view, then I don't think it's a faith worth having. Me personally, that's just my opinion. But I do just want to let everyone know that because everything my guests say, I don't agree with. But again, I'm hearing people out. I want to hear what the experts have to say on certain things. I want to know what their opinions are. And I think it's important that we have these discussions. But I just wanted to let everyone know that not everything in these videos reflect my own personal views. All right, guys, welcome back to the Take a Closer Look podcast. We have a very special guest today, Rabbi and Dr. Josh Garroway. Rabbi Garroway is the Sol and Arlene Bronstein Professor of Judeo-Christian Studies at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. He earned his doctorate from the Religious Studies Department at Yale University and was ordained at the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College in 2003. He is the author of The Beginning of the Gospel, Paul, Philippi, and the Origins of Christianity, and Paul's Gentile Jews, neither Jew nor Gentile, but both. Rabbi Garroway is a native of Rochester, New York, and he currently lives in Pasadena, California, with his wife, Christine, and their 3 boys. Dr. Garroway, welcome to the podcast, and Chag Sabeach to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. I want to talk to you about your book, Paul's Gentile Jews. Anyone who's read the Bible knows that Paul is a interesting and complex guy. He's trying to figure out how to harmonize his Judaism with his newfound belief that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel. And he was trying to figure out how non-Jews fit into this new covenant family and what their relationship was to Torah. And I found your book really convincing on these issues. And I think you did a really good job of capturing the nuance of Paul and letting Paul speak for himself instead of trying to make his message more palatable because of maybe certain modern concerns that we have. So I thought maybe a good way to start out is, can you give like a 5-10 minute overview of the argument of your book, just so the people listening can get an idea of where you're coming from, and then we could dive into some of the details?
Sure. So this was my first book, which, as with many professors, was my dissertation originally. So the book began really in my second year as a graduate student, when I became interested in a number of exegetical problems in the Pauline corpus related to the way Paul describes the people that he has preached to and introduced to his gospel, who were almost exclusively, before they met Paul, Gentile in extraction. And what I found fascinating is the way Paul seems to acknowledge, on the one hand, that they are not Jews. Even after their baptism, they're not Jews. In some ways, they're Gentiles. They're not Israel. They're not circumcised. You can go on and on with the terminology. But on the other hand, Paul seems to say in some passages that they are Jews. They are Israel. They are circumcised. And so there's this paradox in Paul's letters where he describes them both ways. And so I became interested in that question. How is that possible? Why is Paul doing this? And, because you're a graduate student, your mind just changes like that because you read a book or you take a course and all of a sudden something opens up and you say, holy moly, now I see a new way to think about this. And for me, it was a course that I took, a required course in theory, which the semester I took it in grad school was post-colonial theory.
Mm.
And I am by no means a post-colonial theorist. I'm not really a postmodernist, either in disposition or in perspective or in capability. But what I became fascinated by in that class is the way in postmodern studies, it's common for example, a person to be, for example, an Indian person, to be both Indian and not Indian, and English and not English, and in a whole variety of other colonial contexts, the way the interaction between two groups coming together produces people who are simultaneously one thing and its opposite. And I became very interested in the work of a writer named Homi Bhabha, which I'm convinced I still don't quite understand. But what I did understand from it is that this conflict between being one thing and the opposite, being English and not English as a colonial subject, or Indian and not Indian, or whatever you choose, it's a very difficult and unstable position that ultimately needs to be worked out. And Bhabha referred to this as the third space of enunciation. When you're both English and not English, you need to enunciate a new thing that you are. So what I began to think about is maybe the problem for Paul is that what Paul's trying to describe is something that's Jewish, but it's not Jewish like anybody else previously understood. Yeah, so Paul would say, yeah, you're not Jewish, but you're Jewish. You're not in Israel, but you're in Israel. And what happens is that attempt to negotiate a new kind of identity produced, on my reckoning, a third space of enunciation where these Gentiles who were baptized over a course of a generation began to say, well, we're Israel, but we're not Israel. We're Jews, we're not Jews. We're circumcised, but we're not really circumcised. And over time, what this produced in this third space of enunciation was what would later be called the third way or the third race, i.e. Christianity. Mm-hmm. So it was simultaneously a way of explaining some really knotty passages in Paul, but also it laid the groundwork for a theory about how and why Christianity ultimately emerged after Paul as a third thing different from Jew and pagan or Jew and Gentile. And it's precisely because Paul created this unstable paradoxical identity, which I then gave the name to Gentile Jew.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you for that. So you did a lecture. I think it was for an interfaith event. Was that for a Catholic church? The lecture you did on YouTube?
I mean, I've given that a number of times. I think
Gotcha.
that particular one was in Miami. I was talking to, or at Boca Raton.
Boca Raton, yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a synagogue and a church over the course of a weekend. Yeah.
And in that lecture, you brought up Romans 9:6 when Paul says, "Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel," right? Pretty controversial, bold statement. And Paul, being a good Jew, goes to the scripture, goes to the Tanakh to flesh out that point, to argue it. Can you, and I got your slides from that lecture that I'm going to put up on the screen right now. Can you go through Paul's exegesis, how he sees in Israel's history a paring down process of who really is Israel? Can you see that slide, okay. Dr. Garroway?
Yeah, I made that slide at some point a long time ago. So, I mean, Romans 9 through 11 is obviously incredibly controversial and has been read many different ways through the years, and to this day is read in very different ways. And I tend to be a minority in viewing it the way that I do. And to be frank, and maybe we'll talk about this, if I were not Jewish, the way I read the text might be considered offensive to other people.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's genuinely what Paul says, and it's the best
Right.
historical reading of the text, so that's the direction I go.
I
And the
agree.
question, of course, in Romans 9 through 11 is that Paul needs to deal with the fact that the overwhelming majority of his Jewish kinsmen are rejecting the claim of his gospel. And presumably, among the people to whom he's preaching, there are those who say, how can we trust this God that you are representing if this God had a people, the historic people of Israel, and God made promises to this people, Israel, and God had covenants with this people, Israel, and now you're telling us that by and large, this people is missing the boat, and we Gentiles, who for centuries have been off debauching ourselves, now we're God's people? How is that possible? And so that's the question that he deals with in Romans 9 through 11. And I think, as I demonstrate on this slide, and Paul shows in Romans chapter 9 at the very beginning, is he says, look, what you think is Israel ain't God's Israel. And I'm going to spend 3 chapters showing you how that works using the very scriptures of Israel itself. And so he says, look, the notion that I'm advocating now, that some or even most of the descendants of Israel are not actually Israel. In other words, they're not Israel in the sense that they are recipients of God's promise and covenant. Paul says, I didn't make this up. This goes back to the very first generation of the patriarchs. So he says that, look, Abraham had 2 kids. One of them was Ishmael. One of them is Isaac. And on the Jewish reckoning, not the Muslim reckoning, on the Jewish reckoning, they're both descendants of Abraham, but only one of them is the recipient of God's promise, and that is Isaac. And then he goes on to say, look, Isaac had 2 kids. One was Jacob and one was Esau. And before they were even born, they wrestled in the womb, and God determined that the promise would go through Jacob and not through Esau. And then, as you know, Paul has to then deal with the rest of Jewish history, which frankly doesn't work as well for him as those first 3 generations. But he does point out that in the time of Elijah, or primarily in the time of Elijah, there are moments when a huge percentage of the Israelite people falls away and only a remnant remains. And of course, the prophets, especially Isaiah, speaks a lot about a remnant of Israel. And you know that in Romans 9, he also gets into the question of the fairness of this, right? Is it fair that God just decided Esau was out? And of course, Paul gives the lame answer that Job gives and countless other people give, which is, hey, God does what God does. It's not a very compelling answer to me, but it is an answer that is frequently given by ancient Jewish writers. And what I think Paul is showing there is that his argument that in the present moment, there is a huge swath of what you think are the Israelite people, the Jewish people, that are in fact not it, is not some newfangled idea, but it's actually consistent with Jewish scripture itself.
So in your book, you basically take 3 passages in Paul that have been traditionally interpreted to mean that there's still a distinction between Jew and Gentile, between circumcised and uncircumcised. And you actually argue that when Paul's referring to the circumcised in some of these passages, he's actually referring to the Gentiles that have now come into the covenant by faith. Romans 4, 1 through 12 is one of them. Can you talk a little bit about first Romans 4, verse 1, and how you translate it and how it's been traditionally translated and what the difference is?
Sure. This is fun because I haven't thought about some of these texts in a long time. I wrote this book a while ago, but this one I remember very well. I mean, what I try to argue is that Romans 4 is actually the culmination of an argument that's begun all the way back, frankly, at the end of Romans chapter 1. That's not that's not some controversial idea. Most people see, Romans 1, 2, 3, 4 as part of a coherent argument. And what I suggest is that what Paul is up to in those 4 chapters is trying to demonstrate that whatever historic difference there was between Jews and Gentiles, now that Christ has died and been resurrected, those historic distinctions are no longer relevant, because the way a person is determined to be a Jew, circumcised, and a member of Israel, and every other accolade or title that goes along with being Jewish are now accomplished through baptism into Christ. And I argue, based on the work of a Scandinavian scholar whose name I'm probably going to mispronounce, I think his name is Runar Torstensen, that the person with whom Paul is arguing in these chapters is not a Jew. For a long time, the interlocutor with Paul in these chapters was thought to be a Jew, because Paul at one point says, if you call yourself a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And what Runar Torstensen argued, and several others have followed, including me, is to say that no, this guy calls himself a Jew, but is in fact not a Jew. It's a Gentile who thinks that he is becoming a Jew by becoming circumcised and becoming a proselyte to Judaism. But in fact, what Paul is trying to demonstrate is that in fact the way you become a Jew is by being baptized into Christ. And so what happens then in Romans 2, 3, 4 is that this interlocutor keeps kind of pushing Paul. Wait. Are you saying that baptism into Christ makes us a Jew, makes us circumcised? And then in chapter 4, he gets to saying, wait. Are you saying that even the title descendant of Abraham according to the flesh is a title that we Gentiles can take if we are baptized? And at the end of this argument, Paul says, yeah, even that. Now, the reason why I think Paul is saying this has to do with grammar. So in Romans 4:1, Paul has this this tiun erumen statement, what shall we say? And many people have taken Abraham to be the subject of this sentence. And what shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, found?
Mm-hmm.
And I read an article by Richard Hayes, the illustrious scholar at Duke, whose son, by the way, lives in Pasadena and teaches at Fuller and is a friend of mine. But I read this wonderful article where Richard Hayes suggests that this is actually not the best reading of Romans 4:1. That, in fact, a better grammatical rendering of it, based on other things in Paul's corpus, is not Abraham as the subject, but as the object. So that the interlocutor says, okay, what are we going to say? That we've found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? And I think he's right. And I mean, you could read the book and see what grammatical arguments Hayes used and I borrowed. But the one place where I think Richard Hayes missed it is that, and where I think I innovated, is suggesting that the answer to this question is not no. It's yes. That Paul says, what then shall we say? And Paul says this a number of times in his letters. And when the answer is no, when he's introducing a question for which the answer is no, he almost always, if not always, I'll have to go look at the evidence, he either always or almost always responds with some kind of negation, upantos, me genoito, I don't know, some kind of no.
Right.
But when he doesn't say no, it happens a couple of times. The answer is, holy moly, yes. And so here, because he doesn't negate it, I think he's saying, what shall we say? The absurd conclusion that we Gentiles baptized into Christ have found that Abraham is our father, even according to the flesh? Silence, meaning, yeah. And now I'm going to show you how. And the argument culminates then in 4, 11, and 12, where Paul seems to suggest that because Abraham demonstrated his faith in, Genesis 15 and Parashat Lech Lecha, and then was circumcised in Genesis chapter 17, right? The circumcision therefore serves as a fleshly seal of the faith. And so in in verse 12, it says that Abraham became a father of circumcision, not only to those who will become circumcised, which is to say Jews, but also to those who follow in the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised, namely those Gentiles who are baptized into Christ, but not physically circumcised. And the reason I'm able to make that argument is because in verse 12, there's actually two definite article choices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally that's been read to say, oh, Abraham has become the ancestor of the circumcision to those Jews who also have Abrahamic faith. But grammatically, it's permissible, but it's not necessarily the best reading of what Paul's saying. The doubling of the tois, and some commentators even admit, oh man, I wish Paul didn't double this tois. I think it was Cranfield who said, yeah, this must have been a slip of the pen. But maybe it's not a slip of the pen. Maybe the reason Paul doubled the tois is to imply, or not to imply, to say that there are actually two different groups that can have Abraham as a father of circumcision. Group one, tois, being Jews who were physically circumcised. Group two being Gentiles who were baptized into the faith that Abraham had, but were not actually circumcised. Now, I should point out, I think this is nonsense. I think Paul makes a crappy argument here. But I think that's what Paul's argument is. And I said earlier that I kind of have the luxury as a Jewish scholar to say that, yeah, I think Paul takes positions that will largely feed into supersessionism and become, frankly, objectionable for a lot of Christians today. But I should say that as a Jewish scholar, I also have the luxury of saying, I think Paul's wrong. But I'm not. I hope everybody appreciates that when I'm saying this is what Paul is saying,
mm-hmm.
I'm not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Paul was right. I don't think Paul is authoritative. I think Paul was wrong. But I think Paul was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul was really clever. And Paul was a very savvy interpreter of text and history. Mm-hmm. Although in this case, I think he makes a pretty weak argument. But just because it's weak doesn't mean that it's not the argument that he's making based on grammar and context based on grammar and context. Yeah.
When he says Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, is he meaning biological descendancy, or does this have to do with the state of circumcision?
In this particular passage, I think what he's saying is this question is being asked by a Gentile who is figuring out, should I be circumcised because I've been baptized or shouldn't I? And this Gentile is saying, are you saying, Paul, that if I become baptized, I can claim Abraham as a forefather according to the flesh? Surely that claim is only available to Jews who are both descended from Abraham according to the flesh and share the fleshly seal of circumcision that Abraham had. So I think it's both.
Mm-hmm.
And what Paul is saying here is that if you have the faith that Abraham had, you are essentially a sharer in the circumcision that Abraham had, and therefore you are his descendant according to the flesh. The argument that they are also descendants in terms of pedigree
Mm-hmm.
doesn't come up in Romans, I think, in any significant way, but it's featured prominently, as you probably know, in Galatians chapter 3. Again, where Paul makes an argument that I think is borderline fatuous, but nonetheless, it's the argument Paul makes, because Paul wants, in Galatians, his recipients to believe that even though their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is not Abraham, in fact, their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is Abraham.
Right. So Paul clearly knows that being a descendant, there's a biological element to that. Yet he's considering them. Like, does he think that? Like, how is he seeing them as being descendants spiritually, or is he just considering them descendants, even though he knows biologically they're not? I think you used the term in your book that they're reckoned as being descendants. Is that right?
Yeah. I probably use that word, or putative, all kinds of words like that. And I actually use, I think, a helpful passage from the Talmud, which I don't think you have on a slide. But there's a great passage in the Talmud where the rabbis are wrestling with a problem. And the reason it's a great passage for understanding Paul is that it's related to the issue of circumcision. And the rabbis are trying to figure out, what do we do with the problem that there are hemophiliac boys who can't be circumcised? Because in order to be in the covenant with Abraham, you have to be circumcised. But when you have parents that have a son and he dies from circumcision, and then a second son that dies from circumcision, eventually, to be kind, we have to say, the third son, you can't circumcise him, you'll kill him.
Mm.
But does that mean he's not in the covenant? And what the Talmud says, it doesn't say this exactly, but the upshot is what the Talmud says is, he's considered as though he's circumcised, even though he's not circumcised. So to the extent that you have to have a circumcised penis to be in the covenant with Abraham, this hemophiliac boy who has a foreskin, he's actually circumcised. Not in some weird spiritual way, not a Jeremiah circumcision of the heart. For what matters, he's circumcised, even though he's not. And by the way, that passage also goes into the issue of, well, what about non-Jews who are circumcised? Are they in the covenant?
Mm-hmm.
And the Talmud says, no, because even though they're circumcised, they're actually not. And then it also goes into the issue of women. And it comes up with the conclusion that even though women don't even have penises, they're considered circumcised insofar as they are participants in the Abrahamic covenant. It's a wonderful passage. And so what I think Paul is saying is that even though a Gentile baptized into Christ clearly doesn't have Abraham as a real great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, but insofar as it matters, he does. And a Gentile baptized into Christ doesn't have a circumcised penis back then. But insofar as it matters, he does. And that's hard to understand, but we actually, but it's not that unusual that we reckon this kind of identity when that identity matters, but it's impossible to attain.
Great. So this brings me right into my next question. In your book, you argue that this is different from being a spiritual descendant or being spiritually circumcised, as some of the new perspective on Paul guys might say, like N.T. Wright and others, that this is a eschatological circumcision. This is the true circumcision, a spiritual circumcision of your heart and your sinful nature. You're saying, no, it's different than that. They're reckoned as being physically circumcised. Although and when I'm reading, what pops up in my mind, and I think this probably pops up in a lot of people's minds, is, well, is there really a difference? Is this just a pedantic thing? And you acknowledge that, and you say, quote, both acknowledge a change in identity that is wholly intangible or non-empirical in nature. Both are mediated by faith, but the difference is significant. Why do you think the difference is important?
Sure. A couple of reasons. The second is more important, but I'll start with the first. The first is that too often when people say, oh, Paul believes in literal circumcision of the penis and then a spiritual circumcision of the heart, or literal descent from Abraham and spiritual descent from Abraham, a literal Israel and a spiritual Israel. That to me ties into the notion that there are actually two peoples of God, right? There's one that's the physical, older, circumcised, historic Israel. And there's the new spiritual, Christian-based Israel. And that's the kind of distinction between two different Israels that will eventually find its maturation in the Epistle to Barnabas and then Justin Martyr, and it will become the foundation of Christianity and Christian supersessionism. But I don't think that that's something that Paul holds to. I don't think Paul thinks there are two different Israels. What Paul says is that there's one Israel, and that Israel is the Israel that is determined by baptism into Christ. That's one reason. The second reason is that there is a tendency, because of the development of Christianity, to see Christianity as a spiritualization of Judaism, a universalization of Judaism. And therefore, Paul is seen to be the progenitor of that. But I think it's important, and this is maybe where I'm actually more in line with the radical new perspective on Paul than just the new perspective on Paul. I don't know. But it's critically important to see that Paul is not a universalizer in that respect. Paul is not a spiritualizer in that respect. Paul is very much thinking in ethnic Jewish terms, that a Jew has a circumcision of the penis. A Jew is a physical descendant from Abraham. And so he says, look, these people baptized into Christ, they have to be considered Jews. They have to be considered Israel. Well, how can we say that? We have to come up with some way of saying that they are actually circumcised and actually descendants of Abraham, physically speaking. Now, it's impossible. And because it's impossible, and because this identity is only reckoned, it makes sense that after a generation or two, people are like, come on, I'm not really circumcised. I'm not really a descendant from Abraham, maybe in some spiritual sense. And that's why it develops. But Paul is thinking in old-fashioned ethnic Jewish terms. And by acknowledging the difference between reckoned circumcision and spiritual circumcision, we preserve that ethnic Jewishness of Paul, and we don't turn him into a spiritualizer that a 2nd or 3rd century Christian might be like. The third reason this is important, I said there were two, but the third reason is because if we read a spiritualized circumcision as opposed to a reckoned Christianity, a reckoned circumcision, it doesn't explain the texts. So in Romans 2, for example, when Paul is talking about how if you have a circumcised penis and you don't act or believe the right way, he says it's as though you have a foreskin. He doesn't say it's as though you have an uncircumcised heart. And likewise, he says in Romans 2, this is towards the end, the late high 20s, 25, 28, something like that. He says, if you have a foreskin, but I don't know what he says, if you follow the righteous statutes of the law, whatever it is, your foreskin is reckoned a circumcised penis. He doesn't say your heart is reckoned. So Paul is talking about genitals for Paul, that circumcised penis remains important. It's not a spiritualized circumcision of the heart. So it also explains Paul's texts, in my opinion, better than a spiritualized conception of circumcision or descent.
Gotcha. All right. This quote is from your book, page 61. You say that Paul actually agreed with the authorities in Jerusalem that genital circumcision remained the defining indicator of Jewish identity. But in the wake of Christ, he believed that circumcision would now be performed by Christ, not by men.
Yeah.
So why did Paul circumcise Timothy? Because he was Jewish? So he thought it was... So, in other words,
yeah.
if Christ is the agent of circumcision, is that just for Gentiles?
Right. So this is a big question, and this is something I addressed in my second book.
Yeah. Dr. Garroway, I'm gonna. Sorry to cut you off real quick. Yeah. I just want to add this quote to the context of the question.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
This is from Mark Nanos. I believe he's also a Jewish Pauline scholar.
He is,
and this is from the annotated the Jewish annotated New Testament. He says this statement, and he's talking about 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, "To the Jew I become like a Jew; to the Gentile I become like a Gentile; to those under the law I become like one under the law." Although he says, "I myself am not under the law," which is a really interesting statement. But anyway, Mark Nano says this statement has overwhelmingly been read to mean that Paul compromised Torah observance to become like non-Jews in order to gain them to Christ, as well as to mimic the behavior of Torah observant Jews to win them. But Paul does not write that he behaves like each one he seeks to gain. Rather, he explains that he relates rhetorically to each according to the premises from which each works. I don't know if I agree with this. And I'm wondering if the example of Timothy is an example of him placating his Jewish brothers and sisters. What do you think?
Okay. Well, now you've added a second mare's nest. So, okay, let me just say, first of all, that I know Mark. I like Mark. I've hung out with Mark many times. Mark and I do not see eye to eye on how Paul should be read. Which is not to say I don't have tremendous respect for Mark and his work.
Sure.
But this is the beauty of scholarship of ancient texts. People can come to very different conclusions, and Mark and I do. So let me kind of bracket Mark for a second and get to Timothy. There's two questions that have to be asked. One is, did Paul actually circumcise Timothy? Right. Acts says that Paul circumcised Timothy, but Acts is not necessarily historically accurate, in my opinion. I actually think it's more accurate than a lot of other people do. But just because Acts says Paul circumcised Timothy does not mean Paul circumcised Timothy. Second question is, if Paul did circumcise Timothy, or it's a funny way to put it, Paul insists that Timothy was circumcised. I'm not sure Paul was actually wielding the knife. But if Paul did circumcise Timothy, when did Paul circumcise Timothy? Is it possible that Acts knows that Paul circumcised Timothy, but Luke puts it into the narrative at a particular point that is strategic? And so I don't want to get too much into what I wrote about in my second book, but what I argue very in brief in that second book is that Paul, in the first 6 or so years of his career after his conversion, which I put in scare quotes on purpose, after Paul became to believe that Christ was indeed resurrected, in my opinion, in those first 6 years, Paul circumcised the Gentiles. That is why for example, Galatians 5, Paul says, if I'm still circumcising Gentiles, why am I being persecuted? Because my argument in that second book is that Paul, in the first part of his career, was a part of Antiochene missions to Gentiles that included circumcision. And that it was only a third of the way through his career I argue, I think in the year 42, I may be off by a year, that Paul had a second revelation in which he came to believe that, in fact, no, you're supposed to be preaching to Gentiles without circumcision or law observance. And so what I argue in the second book is that Timothy was circumcised by Paul because Timothy, who was from Lystra, was from Turkey, that Paul circumcised Timothy in that first phase of Paul's career. And Luke knew that. But then Luke deliberately delays describing that circumcision of Timothy in order to not give it apostolic precedence, or even to suggest that Paul was doing this before the Jerusalem conference.
Mm-hmm.
And so Luke delays reporting it until after the Jerusalem conference, when the whole matter of circumcision is sealed. And then Luke can make it, oh, Paul just did this because he didn't want to get in trouble when he was walking through Turkey, or whatever the excuse is there. So in the second book, I do have an explanation for why I think Paul did circumcise Timothy, and why Luke reports it where he reports it after the Jerusalem conference.
Interesting.
But as for this quote, no, I think that Paul did not see himself as obedient to the law, as opposed to Mark and a variety of other new perspective on Paul scholars. And I tend to view 1 Corinthians 9, maybe in an old-fashioned way, that what Paul is describing here is his perspective on maybe what we would call adiaphora, and the importance of rhetorical situation, and what my friend Kevin Concannon would call ethnic malleability. That he says, at the end of the day, what really matters is convincing people of Christ's resurrection and getting them baptized. And if I'm around Jews, if I need to play up the Jewish angle to make that happen, I do it. And if I'm around Gentiles, if I need to play up the Gentile angle to make that happen, I do it. Because for him, all of that other stuff is ultimately adiaphora. It doesn't matter. What matters is convincing them of the truth of the gospel.
Okay, so you do see that statement in 1 Corinthians 9 as having to do with rhetoric, then, not so much altering behavior.
No, I do think he would have altered behavior. I think that if he was going to a synagogue in Corinth, he would have eaten the way the people in the synagogue in Corinth eat.
Gotcha.
And if he was at a rich person Gentile's house in Corinth, and they were eating meat from the temple of Artemis, Asclepius, I don't know, whatever, he would have eaten that. And he would have said it doesn't matter.
So what if there's Jews and Gentiles in the same space? This is completely hypothetical. I acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get into the mind of Paul. Then what would he do? Who would?
Well, that presumably is what he's describing in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Right, where he's saying, oh, when people are together, and maybe it's not Jews and Gentiles, maybe it's Gentiles who think they need to be more traditionally Jewish because now they're, now they're a child of the Jewish God, or other Gentiles who are strong in the faith and don't. So it might not be Jews and Gentiles; it might be Gentiles of different opinion or Jews of different opinion. And Paul's concerned because he doesn't want different people within the community to scandalize one another.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think what Paul ultimately says in those chapters is, look, it doesn't ultimately matter.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, we would all get to the place where we realize it doesn't ultimately matter. But because we're not there, and we live in an actual community with human beings that have different vulnerabilities, it's more important to be kind and respectful to your fellow believers than it is to insist upon either eating or not eating in a particular manner. And
So
I think that's the pretty standard reading of 1 Cor 8 to 10.
So okay, so would he abstain then, just not to cause issue?
I think if he were all by himself, he would eat whatever the heck he wants.
Oh, definitely, I agree with that.
But if he were with a community in which eating whatever he wants would scandalize someone in that community and
Hmm.
potentially undermine their salvation, he would eat whatever he was supposed to eat. The only
Gotcha.
issue I think that he doesn't. So maybe this is your next question. If not, I'm going to ask it for you. Why is he so unwilling to waver on the issue of circumcision? Right, to the Galatians, he doesn't be like, look, circumcision doesn't matter one way or the other, because for him, circumcision is the ontological transition. Right, for a Gentile to say, I need to be circumcised, I think he says this in Galatians 3 most convincingly. I think his argument would be that circumcision is like the first of all the subsequent mitzvot. And when you say, I need to be circumcised, what you're saying is, I need to enter the covenant the old way. And if a Gentile says that, what the Gentile is saying is that Christ died in vain. If the Gentile says, no, Christ didn't die in vain, and that's my access to the covenant, not circumcision, then once they are in the covenant through baptism, if they think, you know what, now it's not okay for me to eat idol meat, Paul's more willing to waver on that obedience to the law than he would on circumcision, because circumcision is seen as the ontological fulcrum. It's the thing
Gotcha.
that, yeah, I think, I don't know.
Sure. All right. So Paul says, as you pointed out, he says it doesn't ultimately matter, right? This meat sacrificed to idols. We know that these idols are nothing anyway. There's only one true God. He created all this stuff. And the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking. I'm gonna create another hypothetical here.
Sure.
Paul's is in the diaspora. A Jewish Christian comes to him privately and says, "You know, Paul, I agree with you. I know I'm a Jew. I'm under the law, but I really don't think it matters because my conscience is clear with it. These idols are nothing. And it would make my life much easier if I could eat this meat." Does Paul say, "Yeah, the end of the age is coming anyway. This is passing away, and it doesn't really matter. Go ahead." Or does he say, "No, you're Jewish. These things are binding for you." And
Oh,
as
no.
and
Yeah, that's what you just said is what Mark Nanos would say, or Paula Fredrickson, or Matt Thiessen, a number of, among the best of New Testament scholars there are. So that's a
Mhm,
totally viable position that really
mhm,
bright people argue. I just don't think it's right.
yeah,
In that situation, I think no. I think Paul would say to this fellow, look, Christ has come and died and was resurrected and is coming back any day. Any day. It doesn't matter what you eat. That's the old world. It doesn't matter what you eat. I would suggest, honestly, you should. I think, speaking as Paul, probably it's probably better if you eat whatever you want. Like, that's what you should be doing. But if if you know your mom will find out about it and she'll be upset and that's going to make you angry, yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter
mhm.
as long as you have been baptized and are a part of our community and awaiting Christ's return. That's all that really matters for you.
Would this get him in trouble with the Jerusalem church who well, depending on how historical you think Acts is, the picture that Acts paints is that they were all zealous for the law. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they were still all about Torah observance. And in the end, at the end of Acts, there even seems to be a dispute between Paul and James. It's a very weird encounter where
It is, and I'm
James
not sure it's I'm not sure it's so historical. Um,
gotcha. What would they if they find out about this? I'm assuming they'd be upset that Paul would tell someone, "Yeah, don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter, even if you're Jewish." Would it cause a break?
uh, I think it would make them. I mean, in general, I think people in the Jewish community not just in Jerusalem, but Jews in whatever city in the diaspora Paul was speaking to, if Paul was telling Jews that it's no longer important for you to do all of the commandments that Jews were known for doing in the, eating kosher, observing Shabbat, the big ones that many Jews in the diaspora did. If Paul was telling them not to do that, sure, I think that would have made them upset. Ultimately, I don't think that's what got Paul in big trouble, because I don't think that most of the people with whom Paul was speaking were Jews. Because I happen to read Paul as being somewhat devoted to the idea that there was a division between his mission field and that of Peter in Jerusalem. And so, which is not to say that Paul didn't go to synagogues or ever speak to Jews, but I think Paul saw as his primary purpose speaking to Gentiles, and that is primarily who he spoke to. And I think what got him in trouble, and this is what I argue in both of my books, is that it was Paul's understanding and Paul's claim that these Gentiles, by dint of their baptism, became Jews. And then I think many of these Gentiles claimed to be Jews. I think that's what's happening, for example, in Revelation 2 and 3, where you have these, people that claim to be Jews but aren't. I agree with the people who read those as Pauline Christians. And I think that's ultimately what ticked Jews off the most, is these Gentiles who really didn't change their behavior, didn't become Jews in any real sense from a Jewish perspective, but were now baptized and were claiming, yeah, we're Jews. We're now the people of the God of Israel. And Jews were like, the hell you are. And I would have been one of them. I mean, don't get me wrong. But I think that's what happened.
All right. So that in itself seems like evidence that Paul may have changed his behavior according to who he's around. Because if he's in Jerusalem, he's probably, playing up the whole Torah observance thing, oh, that's kosher meat. Let me get some of that, good stuff. And then when he's out in the diaspora, he's saying, it doesn't really matter. Everything's really clean ultimately. But okay, so he says, thus Judaism, Paul believed, should announce that it was time for the nations to turn to Israel's God, the one and only God through Jesus. The Gentiles do not become Israel when that day arrives. Rather, they must remain members of the other nations, just as was expected. But they do become fellow members of the Jewish way of life, that is, of the Jewish communities and the religious practice of Judaism. Jews remain Jews in that day, which was so fundamentally obvious for Paul and his contemporaries that it was not even a topic of discussions. It was simply assumed. So I think what Mark Nanos is saying is that in order to instantiate this eschatological vision of Gentiles coming to worship the God of Israel alongside Jews, a distinction still had to be in place. Do you agree with that? And
no,
you don't agree with that? Okay.
This is the foundational position of it's been called the radical new perspective. Sometimes it's now called the Paul within Judaism perspective. Mm-hmm. And it is the belief that what Paul says about the obsolescence of the law or things related to that, things related to not observing Jewish law and life, that those pronouncements apply only to Gentiles. Because what Paul believed is that the purpose of Christ's dying and being resurrected was only for Gentiles, that God's relationship with Jews and Jewish people and Jewish life and the Torah remain the same. And there are some texts that support that point of view. And as Mark points out in this quote, there are a number of prophetic predictions that might lead us to think that that's what a person like Paul would have thought was going to transpire at the end of times. My dispute with this radical new perspective, or the Paul within Judaism perspective, is that I think it just doesn't account for enough of what Paul actually says in Paul's texts, right? For example, the olive tree in Romans 11, right? To me, it's a clear indication that Jews who do not accept Christ as died and resurrected, as having died and been resurrected, are falling off of the tree. Right? I mean, that is a very clear metaphor that suggests that they are in some way losing or abandoning their Jewish identity. I don't remember exactly what the previous slide, what Mark said, but that was the first text that came to my mind. It was like, well, how do you account for that text? And then there are other passages in Paul's corpus that I think the radical new perspective folks often just ignore because they can't make sense of it. And the one I pointed to a number of times is 2 Corinthians 3, where to me, it seems obvious that what Paul's saying is that, let's see what Mark says here.
I think he's talking about Jewish Christians in this text, that they still should remain Jews in the sense that they observe Torah to instantiate that eschatological.
Oh, but I think he's also talking about just regular Jews who aren't Christians. Like the point of the new perspective, the radical new perspective, I think that their claim
I see what you're saying.
Is that it doesn't even matter if Jews acknowledge Christ, because God's deal with Jews is ironclad. And they often rely on a Romans 11:26 and say, yeah, there's some disbelief now that's ultimately not that important, but it's all going to get corrected in the end anyway. And that what Paul really only cares about is the way Gentiles are acting.
Right. Yeah. And it would be strange if Paul spent all that time redefining Israel, making these arguments, using the imagery of olive tree, and then just completely went back on it all and said, well, all Israel will be saved anyway. Which leads me into my next question. Romans 11, 25, 26. Let me pull it up here.
Yeah, that's a doozy.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I'll just read it, and then I got a few questions.
Sure.
So that you may not claim to be wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. What is this hardening in Paul's mind? And when does it end? Well, what's the point of it?
Well, so that's good. You started with an easy question, because I don't think there's much dispute. New perspective, old perspective, radical new perspective. I think everyone would agree that the hardening that's being described here is a description of those Jews who have heard the message of Christ's death and resurrection and rejected it. But that's where Paul starts this whole unit in the beginning of Romans 9, is with that quandary. And here he's come full circle to the end of that argument. And he says, yeah, look, there are Jews who don't believe because they have been hardened, which of course is a very old prophetic idea. They've been hardened. Now he says, you have it a part. Yeah. Okay. So he makes clear that it's a part of Israel. Why? Well, because there's him and there's Peter and there's James.
Oh, I see.
There are plenty of Jews, depending on how you understand plenty. There are some Jews who have not been hardened, but most have been hardened.
Is this a purpose clause? A hardening has come upon a part of Israel so that the full number of Gentiles can come in? Or how do these two, how does
well, I'd have to look quickly at Romans 11. I don't think it's a purpose clause. No, it's not a purpose clause. I think it is I don't know the precise grammatical name for it. I think what he's saying is that there are two simultaneous events happening. There's a hardening of a part of Israel, while whatever the predetermined number of Gentiles who are going to enter Israel is, come in. Right? Because why? Because there needs to be room for them. And that's what Paul just described in the olive tree. Branches are lopped off.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hardened Israelites, the hardened Jews. Branches are glued in. That is the full number of Gentiles, whatever those are. And I think you asked the question, when is that going to end? I think, in Paul's opinion, very shortly. Maybe when he gets to Spain, but Paul seems to suggest in other letters that he sees all of this coming to fruition in his own lifetime.
Right.
And then, of course, I make a big deal in my book about the next line, the beginning of verse 26, which is hutos. Because a lot of people translate verse 26 as if the Greek was tate, as if it said, and then all Israel will be saved. But I think that Paul uses hutos, I think they call it the relative adverb of manner or whatever it is, right? It as if it's describing the process that occurred in the previous verse, right? The way in which all Israel is going to be saved. God's Israel, God's final Israel is going to be saved through a process that involves hardened Jews falling off and saved Gentiles being glued on. That's the process. That's how you get Israel. It's not some eschatological event. So most people read the proof text, out of Zion will come the deliverer, as if it's saying, yeah, in the future, Jesus is going to come back from the Zion above. I don't think that's correct. From the Zion above, Jesus is going to come back. He's going to banish all of the ungodliness, all of the hardening from all Jews, and all Jews are going to be saved. Yay. I don't think that's right. I think what Paul's saying is that this line, out of Zion will come the deliverer, is referring to Jesus when Jesus first came.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus came out of Jerusalem. His message goes from Jerusalem out to the world, where this message banishes ungodliness from Jacob, meaning the real Israel, the actual Israel that is out there, which is comprised of Jews who constitute the remnant and Gentiles who are brought in, which is exactly what he says at the end of Romans 9, that the final people is going to be a remnant combined with the people foreseen by Hosea, the non-people that become people, that's Israel.
Right.
Now, you can understand why for many liberal Christian scholars and for many Jewish scholars, that is a difficult reading because
Sure.
It seems to suggest that Paul is saying Christians are the actual Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's because that's what Paul, in my opinion, is actually saying. But I can say Paul's wrong. In my view, Paul is wrong. But that's what Paul, I think, is saying in order to make sense of his experience, as you said at the very beginning of this interview, his experience of being a Jew reconciled with the idea that he thinks Christ rose from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying to put all of that together.
Sure.
And his belief is that there is this new Israel in the end of times.
Right.
And I feel confident saying I think Paul was wrong. And Paul was definitively wrong on any objective standard because he thinks Jesus is coming back soon. And Jesus didn't. So he's wrong. But his texts were preserved, the movement was preserved, and eventually this came to be the foundation of what would become a truly repugnant Christian supersessionism, which would lead to all kinds of Jewish misery. I understand that. But I think when one sees Paul, and maybe it's unethical to do so, but if one sees Paul as separated from the tradition that emerged after Paul, one can read Paul historically and acknowledge what Paul says without any guilt about doing so.
Sure. Yeah, and to be fair to Paul, as a first century Jew, he's not advocating for a supersessionist theology. He sees it, I would call it a fulfillment theology. He thinks the promises made to the patriarchs are being fulfilled in a way that was just kind of unexpected.
He's a Jew trying to make sense of a wild experience that he had with the belief that the end of the world is about to happen.
And that leads me to my...
let's just look. I mean, that's such an important point that too many people miss, that if we understand Paul as that kind of figure, right, it's okay that he says certain things that when Justin says them 100 years later, or Christian fathers say them 300 or 400 years later, or the Pope says them 1500 years later, are different and sound different and can be judged differently than Paul in his mid-first century exclusively Jewish context, before there even was a thing that anyone understood as Christianity. And I try to teach people to give Paul that benefit of the doubt, because you may know that Paul is not especially well liked traditionally among Jews. And so I try to give Paul that benefit of the doubt and convince others to do so, but I haven't been very successful.
Gotcha. All right. So Paul's eschatological expectation, right? Jesus is coming back. We who remain alive will experience this, etc., etc. What do you think Paul actually expected to happen? Because I know there's been some conversation in scholarly circles. What does the apocalyptic end of the age even mean? Is it the literal end of the world? Is that just interpreting metaphorical language too literally, and we don't understand the imagery in this, ancient apocalyptic Jewish language?
Yeah.
Did he think the world physically was going to end, or did he expect just a change in the way God relates to man? The end of the age, I think, is a better way of describing it. And to go along with this question, I just want to bring up 2 Thessalonians. I know this is considered a Deutero-Pauline epistle, although I think there's good evidence that Paul wrote it.
I'd say I'm 60-40 against.
6 against. Okay. All right,
but I mean, I'm 99-1 against when it comes to Ephesians. So 60-40 against isn't so bad. Yeah.
Gotcha. So the recipients at the Thessalonian church in 2 Thessalonians, some of them believed Jesus returned already. The end of the age happened. If they were expecting a physical end of the world, Jesus coming back on a cloud and, the whole globe burning up, how could they possibly think that they missed it?
Oh, well, let me just make sure. Do they say that this is the first line of 2, right? Do they say that he has come back, or do they just say, that the day of the Lord is, so it's an estikin, that the day of the Lord is here. But I don't think they say that Jesus has come back. Let's get back to the first question. So the question is, what did Paul think was going to happen? And I guess my answer would be, I have no idea. I mean, I'll say a little bit more, but I think it's fair to say that Paul did not have the vision of revelation in his mind. Maybe he had a vision like Daniel. I don't know. It's possible, because all we have to work with is, you can tell me if there's more, but I would say we have the passage in 1 Thessalonians 4, and we have 1 Corinthians 15. And if it's authentic, or maybe it's not authentic to Paul, but it goes back to something Paul taught, who knows, we have 2 Thessalonians 2. Is there more that you have in mind?
Where is it in 2 Thessalonians? I should know, but I'm trying to find it here.
So it's 2 Thessalonians 2, where apparently there's people are like, yeah, the day of the Lord is already here. And he's like, no, there's not, because the lawless guy has to come first.
Right. Okay.
That's second. Yeah, that's 2 Thessalonians 2. And okay, maybe that's Pauline, I don't know.
Okay, so it's right in the beginning. Okay, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus at Christ and are being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by teaching allegedly from us, whether by prophecy or word of mouth. Okay, asserting that the day of the Lord has come. So this is about the return of Jesus.
Well,
'Cause
but
he says it in the
it may
first
not.
verse.
It may just be that they're saying that Jesus is not going to come back in the way we thought, and that the day of the Lord, which may be a reference back all the way to the prophets. Amos talks about the day of the Lord. So maybe it's some kind of realized eschatology. And not that they saw God, they saw Jesus in the clouds and there was a whatever. But so,
Sure.
But if we're working with Paul before this, because I think it might make sense if we start with Paul and we say in 1 Corinthians 15 and in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul gives a very bare bones description of what he seems to think is going to happen, which is that there's going to be apparently a trumpet blast and a twinkling of an eye, whatever that is. But real quickly, and with the trumpet blast, Jesus is going to appear. Dead people are going to be raised. Living people are going to be transformed. And he talks about this at great length in 1 Corinthians 15 with, what kind of transformation is it going to be? And it's some kind of non-fleshly spiritual body, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be a reunion with Jesus and all of these revived and transformed people. I don't think Paul says more than that. Now, is he saying that after that, the world is just going to blow up in some stoic fire? Or I don't think he cares, because he doesn't. That's lost. All that really matters is that the people who are saved are going to be in their transformed state with Jesus under God's control. He says that in 1 Corinthians 15. They're eventually it's all God in control, and that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he worries about what's going to happen beneath in the way that Revelation is going to draw out this elaborate program.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, but I do think then that over time, and it didn't take very long, Jesus didn't come back. And I think that's the problem. This isn't some innovative thought. The problem in 2 Thessalonians is that Jesus didn't come back. And so the people are like, well, and this is why I think it's Deutero-Pauline. They're like, well, Paul said Jesus was coming back. Paul told the Thessalonians Jesus was coming back, in our own lifetimes. And now they're like,
to relieve them from persecution that they were currently experiencing.
And they're like, it's been now, who knows, 5, 10, 20 years. People didn't live that long. Lots of people are dying. Maybe even everyone had died. And they're like, was Paul wrong? Maybe that means that the day of, so maybe this ties it. Maybe that means that actually Jesus isn't coming back. And whatever that meant is that Jesus is here with us. Maybe Jesus is here in some kind of prophetic state. Maybe we're living some kind of realized eschatological day of the Lord.
Right.
And we should stop thinking that Jesus is coming back because Paul said that he would and he hasn't. And the pseudo Paul then writes back and says, no. Any day now, the lawless guy is going to be here. And that's how you're going to know that the end is about to happen. So I don't think that it's people mistakenly thought that the transformation of 1 Corinthians 15 or the trumpet blast and the parousia described in 1 Thessalonians 4 had happened.
Right.
I think they're talking about some kind of realized eschatology that isn't spelled out.
Right, which is what I'm wondering, if they had a non-literal expectation of these things being fulfilled, and if they maybe gotten that from Paul. Because how could you, if you're expecting a literal transformation of the cosmos and, people changing into spiritual bodies, there's no way you could think that possibly happened.
I doubt that. I don't think that, but I don't know I can't flesh out what the alternative is, except that it's some kind of realized eschatology that the day of the Lord, and estaken is here, whatever that means.
Sure.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask is because I come from a preterist background. Are you familiar with the preterist view of eschatology?
You'll have to describe it a little bit. I mean,
Okay.
I know a lot about the pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, and all that kind of stuff, and different
Okay.
dispensationalisms. But tell me,
Okay.
describe preterist so I can fit it into my own
Sure.
system.
Preterism, well, there's different versions of it. There's partial preterism and full preterism, which is that all Bible prophecy was fulfilled in the first century, the coming of Jesus, the day of the
Okay.
Lord, all that stuff, because he said this generation will not pass away. And I actually argued in my thesis that the gospel writers are presenting Jesus' eschatological discourse as fulfilled. They're writing after AD 70, and they're looking at the destruction of the temple and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and Israel as the day of the Lord, since the day of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible is a time of warfare. They're
Mhm.
seeing that as Jesus coming back and executing judgment as he promised. What do you think if Paul lived past 70 and this literal return of Jesus did not happen and this literal transformation of the cosmos did not happen? Do you think, I know this is so hypothetical, would he adopt a realized eschatology type of perspective, of a preterist perspective that, okay, no, this happened. He promised judgment and he did it.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, part of me says no, because I see Paul as kind of a bulldog, and I think Paul would stick to his guns about what he thought
Mm-hmm.
was going to happen based on what was obviously a very powerful experience to him in interacting with the risen Christ. Again, I don't believe that he actually interacted with a risen Christ, but he believed he did, and that was an incredibly powerful experience for him. But let me just fudge a little bit by saying it wouldn't surprise me if, say, Paul, and I don't think Paul lived to the year 66, but if Paul did and saw the war and saw the temple fall, it wouldn't surprise me if he had another powerful experience of the risen Christ in which he was given a new understanding of who Christ was and how history works.
Sure.
Because as I argue in my second book, I do think he had two profound experiences. One that converted him to Christ, and a second that inspired him to create a movement that was divorced from Jewish law.
Well, I got to get your second book and read that one. Put the pieces together.
Just read a review or an outline. It's yeah.
All right, Dr. Garroway. Well,
or we can do this again. I'll do a 10-minute spiel on that book.
Sure. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
love to. This was great. But I've had you for an hour and 20 minutes, so I'm going to let you go. Well,
Thank
actually,
you kindly.
this Paul class, I'm going to put you on the spot since I got you here. Are we going to be able to take a class on Paul under you sometime next year, or what's going on? Because I know a few other colleagues. We're all itching to take it.
So that's above my pay grade. I can tell you, and I think I wrote to all the people that matter, saying that I would be more than delighted to teach an elective on New Testament or Paul or anything related to that. But that ultimately my deployment is determined by the director of the rabbinical school, the director of the Lockheim school, the director of the graduate school. I'm a foot soldier and they put me in place. So yeah, you can go to all of those figures and say that Professor Garroway is on board with teaching it. And then hopefully they'll make it happen.
Sounds good. All right, Dr. Garroway. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.